This is Jay Callahan again, another one of my video mini lectures. Welcome back. In the last video, I talked about how some cases an individual may be unable to resolve or deal with or cope with the traumatic event or the meaning and the aftermath of the traumatic event and be unable to resolve the crisis in any way. And then the crisis ends up kind of ending spontaneously. It's self-limiting because physiologically and physically we just can't maintain that level of tension and energy indefinitely. And so people then inevitably settle into a new level of functioning, which might be the same as before, but unfortunately sometimes it's often at a lower level before. And that was the case example that I presented to you in the last video. In this video, I want to talk about a situation where a person, or in fact a group of people, ended up at a higher level of functioning, in my opinion. So this is a case of crisis to higher level of functioning. So sometimes through the crisis and through the help they receive, a person or persons might end up with new coping skills, new strategies of looking at the world, taking a different meaning from the event and things that happen in the world, and they end up able to cope better going forward and therefore at a higher level of functioning. Sometimes this is referred to as post-traumatic growth. And here you see the same diagram that I showed you in the other video, the previous video, but in this case we're talking about the top of the three arrows, in which case a person ends up at a higher level of functioning. So this is a case of the Sangamon County SWAT team. This happened probably about 20 years ago. This Sangamon County is where Springfield is, and the SWAT team there is made up of police officers from the Springfield City Police Department, from the County Sheriff's Department, and from the State Police. The SWAT team was called to a rural house for a hostage situation. An 18-year-old girl lived there with her family. She had previously dated a 21-year-old guy but didn't want to see him anymore, and he didn't like that. He showed up armed and angry to her house, shot several people, shot several others who survived, and I'll tell you more about that. Somehow somebody called the police and the SWAT team was sent out to the scene. Well, let me hold that for a second. I just wanted to mention, when the SWAT team shows up, it's just very interesting, because when we hear about these stories later or read about them in the newspaper or see them on the TV news, they're all kind of packaged and made into a whole narrative that makes sense. But when the police show up in a situation like this, for example, they often know very little about what's going on, and there's no clear beginning and end. They just show up and like, okay, here we are, now what? So in this case, this pretty much all they knew was the 18-year-old girl, the 21-year-old guy who showed up and took hostages and shot some family members. To jump to the bottom line, the situation was resolved, although 2 of her family members died and 2 others were shot but survived. I'm going to tell you more about this in a minute. But the reason I know about this is that another professional and I were asked to do a critical incident stress debriefing. Critical incident stress debriefing, or CISD, is a crisis intervention technique that was originally set up for first responders, military, police, firefighter, paramedics, people like that, who have been through a critical incident, which is kind of a different synonym for a traumatic event. But in this lingo, they tend to call it a critical incident. That a group have been through a critical incident together, and most of the time, police and firefighters and emergency responders of various disciplines handle these things pretty well. They face more trauma in a week than many of us would face in a lifetime, and most of the time they do pretty well. But sometimes there are some incidents that are difficult, more difficult than usual, and then the idea of a critical incident stress debriefing, a one-shot group crisis intervention session has been developed and offered, and has been going on now for 20-25 years. There are a number of voluntary organizations of which I used to be a part. The one I was a part of was the Northern Illinois Critical Incident Stress Management Team, and these volunteer teams exist all over the country with mental health professionals on the one hand, and then trained police officers, trained firefighters, trained paramedics, trained nurses, trained ER personnel on the other, who together would lead the session. So they asked another guy and I to come down to Springfield and to lead this session. The CISD, as I mentioned, is a structured intervention. It has 7 steps and a follow-up. We'll talk more about it later in the semester, and I'll tell you more of the details. But for example, one of the I think important things about CISD is since it is a group process, it involves group support and group normalization of the kind of experiences that people are having. Many times when people go through a traumatic event or a critical incident, as it's called here, they have thoughts and feelings that they feel are weird or not right or unusual. But it turns out this is hardly ever true, and this has led to the handy statement that I have used many times, and I recommend that you keep in mind, which is you're having normal feelings to an abnormal event. Okay? Now, that's actually not 100% true, because again, with any given traumatic event, some people are resilient and come through it okay, and others do not. So it isn't that everybody has these normal feelings to an abnormal event that are distressing to them, but many people do. So Chuck and I did this debriefing. There were 14 SWAT team members with their fatigues and guns at the debriefing. Again, a group session, and I wrote on the slide, here's the story. So I'll tell you the story that the SWAT team told us. Now, in any debriefing, the first step is an introductory step when people introduce themselves, and most times they all know each other, of course, but they're introducing themselves so that we, the group leaders, the group facilitators, would know who they are. And then we tend to go around, not in a round, one person after the other, but after setting some ground rules, which we'll talk about later, confidentiality and things like that. That after some introduction and ground rules, then we have people talk chronologically in the order that the event unfolds, so we can kind of piece together what happened first, what happened then, what happened then. So as I said, the SWAT team shows up at this house. It's kind of chaotic. They're just getting ready to try to figure out what to do, and running out of the house then comes an older teenage girl and a young guy, and they come running out of the house as if they're escaping from something, and they run to the police, and the police grab them and put them behind cover, and the police are taking cover too, right? The hostage taker had a gun, they knew that, but when they get these two people out of sight around the corner behind a car, the girl says, "That's him, that's him, that's him." And it turns out that this was the couple. This was the 18-year-old girl who used to date the 21-year-old guy. He's the hostage taker. He came in her house. He shot several of her relatives. Now, it's not that unusual, in my experience, to not ever understand the details. So, like, why did they come running out like that? Why did he come running out like that? As if he were trying to escape from someone else. It was very bizarre. It didn't make any sense. But basically, excuse me, once she said that, then the police grabbed him and put him under arrest and put him in the back seat of one of the police cars and assigned one of the police officers to guard him. So having accomplished that, then the rest of the SWAT team officers then slowly surrounded the house, slowly made their way in, even though the story from the girl was that this guy was the only one, the only hostage taker. Still, they have to be very careful, slowly go room to room and make sure that everything is safe. Now, in the debriefing, a couple of the SWAT team members took a turn, and again, we're trying to keep it chronologically. The first thing they found in the living room was the young woman's younger daughter, who appeared to be about 15 or 16 years old, lying on the couch in the living room, shot through the head, and she was dead. And the two officers that encountered her, that found her, said in the debriefing that wasn't too bad because she was shot in the head. The exit wound, the entrance wound wasn't bad at all, and the exit wound of the bullet wasn't even that bad. So, you could sort of stand back and it looked like maybe she was just taking a nap. So it wasn't that traumatic. Then the next incident that people talked about, two other SWAT team officers said that they had gone up into the second floor, and that's where they found two other people who had been shot, which actually is an infant and a toddler who the hostage taker had shot, both of them in the head, and somehow both of them were still alive. And from what I heard later, I think they survived eventually. But at the time, here's these two cops who are typically in their late 20s to mid 30s. So they probably, and this came out later in the debriefing, many of them had small children of their own at home, which of course makes it much worse. And one guy in the debriefing was leaning over either the baby who was under a year old or the toddler who was, I don't know, a year and a half maybe, and said that he looked up at me with those blue eyes, but at the same time I could see that he was going into shock. And shock meaning the physiological reaction that happens when people are badly injured. So they called for the paramedics. The other officer is over the other little kid, looking at the same thing. The kid's alive, but he's going into shock. What's going to happen? And it's extremely frustrating for these two officers. They're calling for the paramedics, but the paramedics aren't willing to come into the house until it's clear that it's safe, which I think happened right around about the same time that these two officers encountered the two little kids. That the other SWAT team members had gone through the rest of the house and there were no other hostage takers. So these two cops are waiting for the paramedics, and they're upset and they're angry and they're frustrated. And in the debriefing, one of them said, it was so horrible to be there with that little baby and to see him fading away. I thought I couldn't handle it. I thought I was just gonna, explode or go running out of there. Like I couldn't take it. It was awful. But I looked over at Ed, who was the other cop dealing with the other little kid, and I saw Ed, and Ed seemed to be doing okay. And so I said to myself, okay, well, if Ed can handle this, I can handle it. And that helped him calm down a little bit. And of course, you know what happens next, right? A minute or two later, Ed speaks up, and Ed says exactly the same thing. I couldn't stand it. It was awful. This little kid in front of me, I was afraid he was going to die. And I couldn't do anything about it. And the paramedics weren't getting there, and I couldn't stand it. I couldn't take it. I thought, I don't know, I thought I just couldn't take it. But I looked over at Tom, and he seemed to be okay. And so I said to myself, okay, if Tom can handle this, I can handle this. So, a great example of normalization. It's one thing maybe if I or one of you would say to a cop in a situation like this, well, the feelings you're having are normal feelings in a very abnormal situation. And that would help. I would say it, but nothing would get across that point nearly as much as one of their own saying the same thing. So the paramedics finally got there, and that was difficult. They said in the debriefing it was probably only 5 minutes after they made the call, but it seemed like an eternity. And then it was very upsetting because, starting an IV on a toddler or an infant, they have to use a very small needle, and it's really difficult under the best of circumstances. And the paramedics were freaked out because of the whole situation. And for a while, and again, maybe only a few minutes, but for a while they couldn't get an IV started, which is the first step to try to treat shock and those kind of injuries, bullet wound injuries. Had to keep up the blood pressure. And so they were taken off to the hospital. What else? Okay, so then we're continuing with the debriefing. Two other officers had been searching the grounds. This was a house out in the country, and it had a barn. and they found a dead body in the barn, an adult male. And again, I never got clear who it was. I don't think they ever became clear who it was. It might have been the girl's father, or it might have been an uncle, some other relative. It wasn't clear, but they found an adult male dead in the barn, also shot in the head. And now, as the scene sort of is beginning to wind down, everybody feels pretty safe now, and they have called the coroner, and the coroner's representative has to come out to the scene. We'll be talking more later in this class about the coroner or the medical examiner. In this case, the coroner's representative had to come out to the scene to investigate and certify the cause of death, the manner of death, and the scene where the death happens. And the coroner's representative chose to deal with the sister who died on the couch first. And so these two officers said that they waited in the barn for something like 4 hours before the coroner's representative got to them. And during this time, while they waited for the coroner's representative, they fell into speculating about who was this guy and what happened. How did he get shot? Was there a struggle? Was he shot someplace else and brought into the barn, or did the struggle and the shooting happen in the barn? And this went on, for quite some time while they waited. And I have to tell you, in the debriefing, what these two cops said, now cops do not normally talk like this. And I think it may be because they were younger guys and, things are changing. But these two police officers said during that time, when the coroner's representative got there, they didn't want to give the body over to him. They felt protective. And they said, we developed a relationship with a dead body. Okay? So each police officer in this debriefing had a different story and mostly very articulate descriptions of the kind of struggles and difficulties they went through on this particular incident. And then finally, in the debriefing, a couple of the SWAT officers said, and I know, of course, don't forget, we were really angry at George. And they kind of motioned over there, and George was one of the SWAT officers. And George kind of smiled. And the other cops that said that they had been angry at George explained that George was the officer who was ordered to guard the shooter. Remember, he came running out in the beginning, and they arrested him, and they put him in the back seat of one of the police cars, and George was tasked with standing guard. They didn't take him to jail right away while they were dealing with the situation, so George was tasked with standing guard, making sure he didn't get away. And a couple of the officers said when they saw what had happened, and they saw the sister who was shot, and the adult male who was also shot and killed, and the two little kids that were shot, that they were enraged, and they were like beside themselves that this guy could do that. And they said they got really pissed at George because they didn't want George to be there, because if George wasn't there, they would have shot and killed the guy. The presence of George stopped them. They said if I could have gotten away with that, I would have killed him. Now, you can react to that as you might, and I have a lot of reactions to that too, but that's what they said, and that's part of the experience that they went through at this traumatic scene. So I just have to say, that I've done, I think, about 50 of these debriefings, and this is like one of the best one ever. I so wish I could have a recording of it, but we never make recordings because of the confidential nature of it, and especially police officers, paramedics, firefighters are really kind of paranoid that showing any weakness, like simply attending a debriefing or certainly talking about showing weakness, might reflect badly on them and would be held against them in their careers, would be a setback in terms of promotion and things like that. So absolute privacy is kept, but I would love to have had a recording of this debriefing. Now, the bottom line here is, I don't know for sure. I don't know for sure if these cops were in crisis, but at the beginning, it was very clear that most of them didn't know what a critical incident stress debriefing was, and they were skeptical. They didn't want to be there, and kind of annoyed. But I do believe that at least some of them were in crisis, because what we heard first of all, from the commanding officer who arranged the debriefing, and then from some of them in the debriefing is, what do police do when they go off duty, especially after they've had a difficult shift or whatever. And the classic thing is they go to the bar, they tell morbid gallows humor jokes about whatever just happened, and then later they get irritable and they go home and kick the dog, right? Or yell at the family, whatever. And I know that's a stereotype, but that is a classic kind of thing. I think there's some truth to it. In this case, it turns out there were 14 officers I mentioned. None of them went to the bar. None of them told any gallows humor jokes about what happened, and about 12 of the 14 called in sick the next day. So I do believe this was, very stressful, crisis-inducing for many of them. And the debriefing really did well for them. They were saying by the end, this is really helpful, and especially, I know this is Social Work 101, but they were actually saying, I never realized, but when something's bothering me, it really helps to talk it over with someone else. And as I and the other leader added to them, it of course needs to be someone that you trust and someone that you feel comfortable with, but yes, it is really helpful to talk about these things. So I think some, at least, maybe many, of these SWAT team officers came out of the debriefing with a new perspective of how to cope with things like this, and that therefore they came out at a higher level of functioning than they were before. I have to tell you, it was very satisfying to be a part of something like this. Okay, so this is the SWAT team story, from crisis to higher level of functioning. So this concludes this video, and I'll see you next time.